Okay, so today's show will be dealing with quite a thorny issue. It just reminds us after the Pesach break where we're up to. We were looking at the life and times and of the Baal ShemTov, and more broadly the Hasidic innovations, Hasidic movement. And many weeks back, when we started this, we were looking at some of the social context and the development of it. The fact is that within 50 years of the Baal Shem Tov's death, Hasidus took over East Europe on a phenomenal level, and perhaps as many as 50% of Polish and Russian Jews had already become Chassidim. There was something beyond exciting and spiritually vibrant and dynamic in the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov and his first generations of students that just spoke to people and moved them. We spoke in our last session about what starts off as a seemingly innocuous and innocent and beautiful and inspiring idea, and yet, taken to the extreme at least, some of the consequences can become troubling and disturbing. And that helps us understand the conflict, why at the same time as Chassidus inspired and spoke to so many people, it also led to fear amongst other rabbinic leadership, of course, most famously that which clustered around the Vilna Gaon, but also other figures. And we spoke about the Baal Shem Tov. It's very hard to, in one sentence, categorize what's the common denominator between all the teachings of Chassidus. There's such a vast amount that the Baal Shem Tov seems to have taught that was recorded in the work of his two primary disciples whose writings we have and whose teachings we have, the Maggid of Mezeritch and the Toldos Yaakov Yosef. There's so much there, and to try and find a common denominator is difficult. But certainly part of the message of the Baal Shem Tov, perhaps the most significant message, is this divine suffused world, a world that just radiates the divine, that sparkles with the light of spirituality. And the Baal Shem Tov created something that was accessible to people, that people could relate to, that people could connect to, in which they saw this God-suffused world and found that immensely exciting and inspiring and accessible. And we said one way of thinking of Chassidus is taking the teachings of Kabbalah, primarily the teachings of the Arizal, Rabbi Luria, and his clarification and classification of Kabbalah ideas, and making that relevant and accessible. It's no longer this elitist area of spirituality for unique scholars who are capable of becoming mystics, but it's accessible to everyone. The Baal Shem Tov, we saw in his letter, seems to call upon everyone to engage in the most intense spiritual practices of Aliyas Neshama. Of the Baal Shem Tov describes his own Aliyas Neshama, in which he ascends to the heavenly realms. He describes the concept of Yichudim, somehow bringing a tikkun and unification and elevating the sparks of spirituality that can be found in everything. And then he says, and Mashiach will come when all Jews are doing this. So he seems to call upon all Jews to engage in these mystical practices. And we see this, by the way, in the Hasidic world. To this day, when a Chassid does a mitzvah, he introduces it with the Shem Yichud. I'm not just doing a mitzvah, I'm unifying the disparate scattered sparks of spirituality and bringing them back together. So he's calling upon everyone to become a mystic, and somehow to do that, affecting a view of Kabbalah, innovating a view of Kabbalah. This is my own formulation, this line here, in which Kabbalah becomes psychological. It somehow is capable of entering the psyche, and it seems to me a pattern of Chassidus is taking psychological, Kabbalistic ideas, Kabbalah ideas, and showing how they can be found internally within our own psychological experiences, which then go on to a sociological revolution, the Chabura, the Chevra of Chassidus. We're all working together. We're accessing the spirituality through the leadership of the tzaddik, and out of that it flows. Now, as beautiful as this idea of this God-suffused universe is, that we discussed in the previous session how, taken too far, there can be dangers within this. And it can drift towards what's known philosophically as pantheism, the idea that God is in the universe. We'll often say that, we'll say God is everywhere. But by that we mean that God is beyond, traditionally we mean that God is beyond time or space. If we literally mean he's everywhere, and the sort of children's song which is often sung under the teaching of a Hasidic group actually, Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is absolutely everywhere, up, down, etc. We're suddenly, theologically, creating problems. Do we mean God is here and here and here and here? Is he material? Is he spatially spread? Is he all over the place? Is that what we mean? We don't normally mean by saying God is in everything and everywhere, we mean he's above time and space. We don't normally mean he's within time and space, that he somehow manifests in the spatial, physical sense. If we take these ideas too far, and we see reality as an illusion, and you can see something appealing about it. You'll often hear that sort of discourse in the film world. Physical reality is just an illusion. It's not real. Someone wrote to me just yesterday, I think listening online to my shiurim, and saying, so are you saying the answer to Simpson, this paradox of how can an infinite God relate to a finite universe, is that reality is an illusion? And it's tempting to go down that path. But what does that mean? Because if it's an illusion, then what is human achievement and accomplishment? What is halacha? What does it mean to say this is proper to do and this is inappropriate to do? This is good and this is bad. Does that fit the first chapter of Bereshit, in which it says God did create a universe? So however we resolve the paradox, what do we mean by saying reality is an illusion? We may mean something more subtle. It's somehow less real than God's existence. Well, that's a classic of Jewish philosophy. But if we mean it's an illusion, then who's being alluded to? Or is our own existence an illusion? What are we? And what sense would that make? And is the purpose of creation simply some Buddhist ideal of the disappearance of self? Again, in early Hasidic literature, there's a lot about bittul hayesh, nullification of that which is, ceasing to see the material and the physical and even the ego and the sense of self as anything. If we cease to exist completely, then who is it that's in a relationship to God? In what way are we relating to God? If the purpose of existence is complete destruction of self, then what was the purpose of ever being created to exist? Just to go through a cycle of misery and then cease to exist? So taken far, these ideas that the purpose of existence is to take the ani, the I, and move it into the ayin, the nothing, the rearrangement of the letters, aleph nun yud to aleph yud nun. The Hasidic Kabbalistic idea of saying, don't view existence as yesh me'ayin, as something from nothing. That's creation. No, creation is ayin miyesh. Before creation, there was a yesh, there was the existence of God. And post-creation, there's nothing, because God's presence is concealed. So a beautiful set of ideas taken superficially and not thought through can lead to very troubling consequences. Now, I'm not here in this presentation taking sides, God forbid. It's not my role to take sides, it's not my business to take sides. It's irrelevant, a personal view here. We're talking about great figures. We're talking about the Baal ShemTov, the Maggid and Mezeritch. We're talking about good, figures revered by probably the majority of the Orthodox world now, by all of the Orthodox world. We all revere these figures, but directly framing the spiritual experiences, probably the majority of the Orthodox world. I'm not here trying to take sides, and it remains one of the enduring mysteries of Jewish history to what degree there really were these trends within early Hasidic thought, or this was a misunderstanding. Is this deep and subtle and profound ideas that in the process of popularizing them are being misunderstood somehow? And that led to the opposition of the Vilna Gaon to these ideas? Or are there really undercurrents of a pantheism there? Are there really some ways in which they are squaring the circle? There are stories around early Chassidish masters. Even the great Baal HaTanya, the founder of the Chabad Chassidus, Rabbi Zobin, lying on his deathbed saying, I've achieved the state. I'm looking up. He's lying on his deathbed. He's looking up. He says, the rafters of the roof have disappeared. And in other words, material has become immaterial. The world is but an illusion. Is that meant literally? Where does this go? I think I mentioned in the last session a horrific story we had in school many years back, in which a so-called Hasidic thinker had the kids chanting "good is bad and bad is good," and this extreme antinomianism. Antinomianism is a philosophical term for negation of the law, in which everything becomes an illusion. There are early traditions that someone, perhaps a simple thinker, came to the Vilna Gaon and said, what's your opposition to Chassidus? Why are you so? And he said, because Chassidim say you're allowed to think in learning in the toilet. Now that's expressing in a quick one-liner a profound theological challenge. If there's no such thing as good and bad, if there are no places of uncleanliness because God can be found anywhere, then is this a negation of the halachic system which does create boundaries? Havdol ben kodesh l'chol ben ola choshech. I hope we say this on a Motzei Shabbos, that the first acts of creation are havdolah, or separation between day and light, between night and light and dark, and so on. So where is this all going? How far are we taking these ideas? And I think we can sense how, in what some can see as this vibrant, exciting, God-suffused world, how others can say this is bordering on the destruction of Judaism, and there's heretical strands that are emerging from this, and you can see why it became so fraught, and so the depth of opposition that was felt was real, because there was this sense that there's something, a potential for something scary and undermining going on over here. So on a hashkafic level, this is what we discussed in the previous week. And on a historical level, this remains a topic of live debate. To what degree are there elements of truth in this string? To what degree was Chassidus really philosophically revolutionary in these ideas? Or to what degree are there tragic misunderstandings taking place around these concepts? Now, I want to remind you, or I want to rather focus today on one aspect of this. And the most extreme version of this philosophical debate is the accusation against Chassidim of approving of the idea of Aveiro Lishma. In other words, can you justify doing something forbidden in halacha in the name of deeper spiritual goals? Can that ever be justified? Can there be such a spiritual practice? Because if you take seriously these ideas of a God-suffused world, if you see God to be found in everything, if you believe that we have to elevate everything that is found in the universe, well, take from the most extreme, maybe even in the darkest, evilest places, God can be found, and going there to find God is something with which we can engage. In a less sort of philosophical form, in a more general form, there always is a tension in Yiddishkeit between the law and the spiritual values that underlie it. We live a complicated system in Yiddishkeit, because on the one hand we have a set of halacha, which is very, very nitty-gritty and precise. We just have Pesach with its fine details about checking the small print on kasherim and cleaning your house and food, and it's so nitty-gritty and technically halachic. You use the pot, and if the water is this temperature, then you now have a treif pot, and if it was that temperature, no matter of a degree, it's a kosher pot. So it's so nitty-gritty and detailed halachically, and at the same time, there's these sort of broad spiritual messages that underlie them. How do you resolve the tension between the two? Which is more important? How are we meant to balance the two? And these aren't new challenges. These are the Nevi'im that cry out, right? Right? God, I'm fed up of all your sacrifices. I hate your Yom Tovim and your Shabbosos and your Rosh Chodesh when you're not looking after the weak and the vulnerable, and you're not engaging in tzedakah and mishpat. So there is this tension between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, and how they go together. It's a complicated discussion beyond the scope of this session, but within our own Masorah, the Nevi'im and others, we have to grapple with this difficulty. And of course, from beyond Judaism, this is a constant point of attack against us. The phrase, the letter of the law, spirit of the law, of course, is a Christian phrase, right? That was used by again, we don't know much about the founders of Christianity, but certainly his students who claimed messaging in his name. This is one of their big criticisms. The Pharisees, the Orthodox Jews, you've got so caught up in the letters of the law that you're missing the spirit of the law, you're missing the deeper value, and the like. So there are aspects of this that reflect a genuine challenge at the heart of Yiddishkeit. You can take an extreme position. Maybe one day we'll do, as a great thinker, we'll look at Rabbi Shai Leibovitz's views, controversial, very, very controversial views. Can take a view that Judaism is just about the law. But almost no one does take that view. Chassidim and non-Chassidim and Maimonideans all take the view that halacha is a framework within which to express and embed a deeper system of values. So as soon as you recognize there's something more than halacha, halacha is a way of capturing and concretizing and promoting a deeper system of values, you're going to have a tension between what do you do if the values and the deeper system, if the law and the values contradict each other. How do you resolve that? And Chassidim are being accused of taking a stance on this matter in which they are going quite extreme in one direction. So thus goes the accusation. In today's show, we'll try and look at is there truth in this to the best of our ability to navigate it. And they're being accused of weakening the halachic system and promoting spiritual values above the diktuk halacha, the number crunching element of halacha, the precision of halacha, and the accusation of antinomianism as being against halacha, against the law. Just to contextualize this in the sociological and historical background, don't forget we are less than a century after the Sabbatean heresy, which does exactly that. Mate Isurim. We mentioned this in previous weeks. Shabbos Tzvi changes the bracha to Hashem. Shabbos Tzvi argues on Yom Kippur, on Tisha B'Av, we should be eating, we should be partying. Shabbos Tzvi himself engages in seemingly and promotes his students in extramarital relationships and in horrific actions done in the name of now we're in the Messianic era in which halacha has been changed. Then the horrible offspring of Sabbateanism, which is Frankism, the Frankist movement, which again I mentioned, in which there is really profound filthy stuff taking place in the name of the law and in the name of spirituality, eventually ending in the mass conversion to Catholicism of the Frankists. So we're dealing in sensitive times where it's not inconceivable that within Jewish mysticism, profoundly anti-halachic stuff is emerging, and this also creates some of the fear around Chassidus. And again, we see some early opponents of Chassidim claiming they are Sabbateans. They are closet Sabbateans. This is a renewal of the Sabbatean heresy, God forbid, and therefore this is this is a very sensitive matter, very sensitive time. That we know, by the way, of course, Chas v'sholom is historically completely incorrect. There are lots of research. There's no trace, Chas v'sholom, of Sabbateanism or Frankism in Chassidus, but there's something there. We have yet again a mass movement promoting mystical ideals built around charismatic figures that seem to be weakening allegiance to halacha. You can see why this becomes so fraught. Not that long after the time of the Baal Shem Tov, so till now we've been speaking about movements pre the Baal Shem Tov, not that long after the time of the Baal Shem Tov, modernity begins hitting the Ashkenazi world. It's made its way up from Italy into Amsterdam, then into Germany, and then beginning to work its way eastwards, eventually into East Europe. And of course, reform and the more extreme fringes of Haskalah are saying similar things. They're also accusing traditional Jews of being so caught up with the letter of the law that they're forgetting the spirit of the law, and therefore there's a need to reform. We need to go back to the core Jewish values and not worry too much about halach and so on. So this is after Chassidus, so this isn't an immediate fear on the minds of, and of course Chassidim become amongst the biggest opponents of modernization of Judaism and so on. But it's in the air. And this is all part of the tension around this claim of that Chassidim are somehow weakening halacha and allegiance to halacha. So I'll pause for a moment just for questions, but what I would like to do in the remaining time is to try and look at what evidence is there around this. Do we see any trends of this taking place? And what can we say about the truth or lack of truth? Are there any elements of this going on in Chassidus? And by the way, the last sources I will discuss date to this day. So is any of this going on in the modern Chassidish world? Are there still any living trends of this sort of slightly different balance than perhaps the non-Chassidish world has in these matters? I'll pause for a second. We've done a very whirlwind summary of the last couple of weeks, or the last couple of sessions pre-Pesach, but I hope that brings us back into the sugya. Yes.
They, in other words, about ShemTov, could have kept it within the frame of halakha and one thought, but could have done another way with different techniques.
So this is one of the, everyone's asking, this is one of the big questions. Was Chassidus state, could it have gone? This really gets to the debate about how revolutionary really was the Baal Shem Tov in his first generation of students. There are those that say that but those that say from outside the Chassidish world, and even within the Chassidish world, some say that the opposition of the Gaon was helpful in forming Chassidus because it stopped it drifting too far and pulled Chassidim back from their early, the early extreme and so on. These are very difficult to know, and I want to emphasize, I can't emphasize enough, we're talking about the greatest of the great over here, and I'm very sensitive when I'm speaking here about, there's a balance between trying to historically understand these matters, to try and draw, part of the purpose of this is that we can draw spirituality. I hope this isn't just a cold clinical share. I hope some of these ideas can be inspiring for us as non-Chassidim, and at the same time to sort of critically engage with these ideas. Very difficult to know what to make of this and what could have been and the like. Yeah.
Back earlier on last week, the ideas of little hayation and creation being I hayation, those are part of Hasidic teaching. You said people might misunderstand and take them too far.
Yes.
I don't understand at all what that's how they limited themselves, how they reconcile that.
Okay. So the question being asked about the ayin miyesh idea, well, surely these are Hasidic ideas. So what I mean, am I just being politically correct when I say taken too far? But is this what Hasidus are saying? The problem is that all Kabbalah and this really gets back to the Rambam pointing this out in his Moed Nevuchim. When we're talking about the relationship between infinite God and finite universe, we're stuck with human language and the language of metaphor. And the question always is, to what degree are terms meant literally, and to what degree is it metaphorical language? To what degree is it trying to circle around an idea, but every intelligent reader understands it's not meant literally? So let's go back to the Torah itself. Zroya outstretched arm, Yod Chazaka. Right? So we're trying, when you're trying to capture spirituality in human language, you're always trapped in the limitations of our very concrete way of thinking about things. So if someone wants to make a claim against the Torah, it physicalizes God. You've got enough texts to prove that. But of course, it's not the way we understand it. The Arizal himself and earlier Kabbalists talk about symptom. Symptom means to restrict. How does an infinite God relate to a finite universe? Well, part of the answer is whatever this mystical doctrine exactly means is symptom. Is that meant literally? That God somehow is meant to sem himself, he constricts himself? What does constriction mean of an infinite being? Does that mean he's now somehow boundaried? Well, how do we create for physicality? How do we create space for physicality? All of us are living in a world in which God doesn't seem completely manifest. So there does seem some limitation in the presence or awareness of God. How do we square that circle? So any language we use is somewhat borrowed. One of the claims and counterclaims in the Hasidic world is in the conversations between Chassidim Hassidism and so on, was around tzimtzum k'pashutoi or tzimtzum that not k'pashutoi, and claims and counterclaims about whether tzimtzum, the term tzimtzum, is meant to be taken literally or not. Now, even tzimtzum k'pashutoi doesn't mean k'pashutoi. So the advocates that tzimtzum should be taken literally, even they don't mean literally. So this is part of the problem with talking. One of the things I try and achieve in this year is share my obsession around philosophy on the one hand, and also share my belief that philosophy is a very limited discipline on the other hand. And however much you geek around philosophy, it's in some respects offers very few answers to the questions that trouble all of us in life. And this is a classic example. I hope nothing I'm saying is doing this to you, but this is a classic way of putting everyone off any of these topics, because maybe I'll do a one-off share just looking at symptom and the debate, what symptom means, and the debate between the Chassidim and non-Chassidim about the translation of that term. But all I'll say for now is that to what degree did Chassidic masters mean these terms literally, and to what degree were they? We're dealing with mystics here. We're dealing with people who are thirsty for God. So listen to the songs that we sing. Right? These psukim, David Melech. In Judaism, and I hope all of us in this room can feel that first. We should walk around God intoxicated. There should be a part of ourselves that just longs for connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I want us to emerge from this shift, at least momentarily, seeing the dazzling, look at this cup of coffee and just seeing it. We don't do this enough. We're not mystical enough in our lives. Just look at this and see there's something beautiful here. The beautiful color of the cup, the color of the drink, the wonder of existence. And mystics live in that world of the wonder of existence. And they struggle to express their love and their overwhelming sense of the presence of Hashem. And they always end up using poetic, metaphoric language because you can't capture it. It's always like that. The Rambam himself, the sort of supposed master of rationality, he uses language that is impossible to use unless he went through mystical experiences himself. He lived within awareness of life. He describes in his Mishnah Torah the tension between Avas Hashem and Yiras Hashem. And he uses language that anyone who engages in these practices knows of you feel this intense love of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and overwhelming. And as you draw closer, suddenly near Talachori, you're thrown back in fear because you suddenly become overwhelmed by the presence of God. And these are languages used by the mystics constantly in every mystic, and by the way, outside Judaism, also in every faith. Anyone who wants to connect to Hashem describes the same way these sorts of experiences. All of us should be experiencing these things. As we stand davening Amidah, we should spend some moments where we close our eyes, and this is a halacha that we're omid lifnei hamelech. So just close one's eyes and for a few moments, just be aware that I'm standing in the presence of Hashem, and just feel the awareness of God of us, and then one does feel that sense of being thrown backwards and that sense of being overwhelmed by the spiritual experience. So Chassidim are part, again, they're doing something unique, but they're also part of a tradition that we find in Yiddishkeit, well beyond Chassidim, and outside Judaism even, of mystics struggling to express The word mystic means this. The word mystic means union with the divine. That is what mysticism is. A longing for union with divine and living with an awareness of union with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And by definition, when you do that, you're going to struggle to capture these ideas. And this is really the problem at the heart of Chassidus, which is maybe the whole criticism of Chassidus can be summed as trying to take something which is an elite pursuit and commercialize it, not mass it, make it a mass movement. Maybe the very problem is just that when you learn, Kabbalah was traditionally learnt by Talmidei Chachamim, who have engaged in being taught and so on, and they could deal with these subtle ideas. But Chassidus is saying everyone should be a mystic. And maybe by definition, when you're trying to make everyone a mystic, these ideas are going to be misunderstood and be taken literally. So this remains a very complicated matter. How literal were early Chassidus, in these ideas, and how much not were they really coming to negate reason and to negate halacha in some level, some subtle level? I'll give away the punchline. I mean, there's no doubt they're not coming to negate the halachic system completely. But are there elements of that? Are there aspects of that? Are there strands and strings of that? Maybe yes. So this is the difficulty over here. So I saw someone else wants to ask something before. Yeah, I'll take that. Yeah. Okay. So the history of the concept of Avera Lishma is already in the Gemara. The Gemara already speaks about such an idea in very, very rare occasions. Esther Hamalka is told by Mordechai to go into King Achashverosh. Now, King Achashverosh is a monster. We don't emphasize this when we tell the Megillah story, but Chazal understood it, that she's going on some level as his wife or one of the harem of Achashverosh, and she's going in to make herself available to seduce him. That's what it means to go and see the king when you're the consort of the king. And Esther Malka replies to Mordechai saying, "You're asking me to do that? It's revolting on a personal level, and it's revolting on a halachic level. Till now, I've been honest. It's been by force. I've had no choice." And the Gemara discusses Yehovah V'Yava, not Yehovah V'Yava. But now I'm making myself available, and this is how Chazal understand it. Avadati. If I'm lost, I'm lost. I'm sacrificing my spiritual life for the sake of the Jewish people, because I'm engaging in something horrible and revolting. Because that's what it means to go into the king. It's saying to the king, "Here I am, and do what you want with me." So these are discussed in the Gemara here and there, but we're talking about, I don't know, 3 events in Jewish history. Extraordinary events where the whole future of Klal Yisrael's existence is affected. And Gemara talks about this, about Yoel, Eishes Cheva Keni, when the Sisera story, where she perhaps seduces Sisera, the running away general in Sefer Shoftim, and then kills him with a peg. There's rare occasions where this is sort of discussed, but the accusation against Chassidim is, and again, I want to emphasize that there's no evidence or claim that we're talking about a mass undermining of halachic system. We're not talking, God forbid, about Sabbateans or Frankas here, but are there any elements of introducing this slightly more into Avodas Hashem? And the answer is maybe, and we'll have to look at that in detail in a few minutes. Yeah.
The Egyptian scientists sound more like Avera Toelet rather than Avera Lishma. There's a specific end point, a specific gain.
Yes. Yes.
This world gain rather than connection to the divine.
Yes, yeah, and that's the claim over here, right? Is the concept of Avera Lishma applied in very, very rare occasions, such as saving the whole of the Jewish people, which to this day remains a running issue, right? All secret services use honeypot agents where they try and trap people for blackmail or get them into the inner lives of people. The idea that you can do something morally beyond repugnant for the sake of the safety of the state is one case. Can you use that for spiritual goals? Much more dangerous idea. Yeah, 100%. Sorry, Neil.
Yes, briefly. But sort of pre-season, there's awareness about teaching the product. To this day, it's introduced right later on because it's quite different. It's difficult to understand. It's difficult to relate to. So there's a lot of danger around introducing too early. And that effectively sort of like a case study. Hasidism was sort of at this stage introduced these ideas which are being widely misinterpreted.
I'm nonsense, right?
The idea that the Baal is treated quite carefully and cautiously. Most people aren't ready for it.
Yes.
Relate to it.
Yes.
And as you've been saying, everybody should be ready
yes.
to this. Well, you see, the problem is that people can't understand it. The language, concepts,
yes, 100%. This is one. I suppose one way of summarizing the chakira, the investigation that we're engaged in today, is to what degree is the controversy, the debate with Hasidus, really a profound philosophical debate about these very core spiritual ideas, and to what degree is it a sociological debate? In other words, real Hasidus isn't doing anything dangerous or controversial. But the problem that's going on is, as you say, for example, we're making a mass movement, and then it's going to lend itself to misunderstanding. The sociological revolution is the problem. To what degree is there a real disagreement, or to what degree is the disagreement built around misunderstanding or popularization of ideas that should never be popularized? Is that the machlokas that's going on? Yeah. Okay. I'll just mention, by the way, that we've discussed Rav Nachman here before in other settings. Amongst the accusations made against early Hasidus, when you read the polemic literature against them, are claims that in the lived experience, they are doing things which are undermining normal rational behavior. And we have articles written against Chassidim in which they say in the new Hasidic shuls, the Shtibelach, the Chassidim are dancing the whole way through davening, they're turning somersaults, they're having too much to drink, and there's a claim that there's an undermining of normal social fabric and undermining of normal rational behavior. We saw in Rav Nachman of Breslov's philosophy that we called him anti-philosopher. He is pushing a viewpoint in which he's taking to the extreme the limitations of philosophy. And he's basically saying the most you can do in life is to know that we have no ability to reason. That the greatest depth of wisdom we can get is to know that we have no ability to reason. You remember the story of the king who discovers that the wheat is poisoned and we're all going to go insane. And the outcome is the most we can do is we can put a spot on our forehead, so at least we'll know we're insane. So there is again within a third generation Hasidic teacher. Menachem Breslov is one generation after the first generation students, a voice that's saying the recognition of irrationality is the highest peak that human can achieve. You can put this in Kantian terms, limits of human reason and the like. And there is a truth in this. Of course, there's a truth in this. Be very cautious about reason. And sometimes the greatest wisdom a human can achieve is to know that we don't know anything. And you can say that Shlomo Melech of Hevel Havolim and the like. But taken to an extreme, it can go far. And we see this again in the lived experience today of Breslov as a fringe wing within Breslov, that they basically seem to spend their time dancing and drinking. And that's the sort of spiritual ecstatic expression of spirituality. Okay, so what can we say about what's real within this and what's not real within this, and what do we really know? So the first thing I want to emphasize is the degree to which the first generation and first generations of Hasidic leaders were also mainstream halachists. I've mentioned this several times in previous weeks. The idea that the Hasidic teachings of the Baal ShemTov was appealing to outcasts and was somehow revolutionary and breaking the hierarchical structure is simply not correct. Those drawn to the Baal ShemTov were the elite. These were elite Talmidei Chachamim and Poskim and Dayanim. This was not a sort of revolutionary movement in which non-halachic practice was the norm. Rav Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, before that he was in Pinsk, was a Rav and a Dayan, the Kedushas Levi, the famous Rav Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev. Rabbi Avram Yisroel of Apt, the Apter Rebbe, Reb Pinchas Halevi Horovitz, who wrote one of the most classic, important halachic works, the Haflah, moved to Frankfurt. His brother, Reb Shmuel Shmelka of Nikolsburg, who became a Hasidic Rebbe, the Koznitzer, Maggid, who was a Talmud Chacham and Posek, Reb Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the founder of Lubavitch, of Chabad, later got named Lubavitch, who wrote the famous Shulchan Aruch Harav, one of the most important poskim of the last few hundred years. It's simply a fact of historical record, and there's many others, by the way, lesser known names, Reb Meshulam Feivish Heller and Reb Uziel Meisels, people who wrote classic halachic works in the very first and second, third generation of Chassidus. So that's the first thing to mention, that it is a fact that the early generations of Hasidic teachers were major halachists. We saw that the Baal Shem Tov himself was one of the three signatories in a very complicated technical halachic shaila around treifus. We have a record of the Baal Shem Tov being referenced in that, when in the town of the Baal Shem Tov there was a controversy around a particular psak of the Rav about whether an animal was kosher or treif, and the Baal Shem Tov was one of the signatories to this. So we know that, again, the idea that the Baal Shem Tov was somehow unlearned in classic Jewish education, was this mystic who arrived at, it appeals to romanticism, the idea of the naive mystic who isn't educated. And like, we know that we now have writings from the Baal Shem Tov. We know that he wrote a very literate rabbinic Hebrew. These things should have been obvious through all time. It was only academics going too far. These are mainstream figures who are very much part of the halachic establishment, and that should be the foundation and premise of anything that we say. In other words, even if there are trace elements of the concept of Avei Lishma here and there, or some areas of halachic change, we should know we're not talking about this in a coarse and unrefined manner. We're not talking about this as a mass revolution that's drifting towards Chas v'Shalom Sabbatean or Frankism or Christianity or Reform, in which there's an attempt to sort of revolutionize the whole halachic system. That simply isn't the case. So what is going on in Chassidus? Well, I want to sort of highlight 6 or 7 things in which there is aspects of halachic change taking place, and some of the controversies around this. The first is that Chassidim are promoting the mass observance of Kabbalah, or mass engagement with Kabbalah, and mass internalizing of mystical practices into Jewish life, into the lived experience. And as a result, Kabbalistic practices begin influencing what Jews do. So in the past, if a Jew wanted to know what they would do, they would look at halacha, and Kabbalah was, you can call it philosophical or mystical doctrine that people would engage in, and at least on a mass level didn't affect halachic observance. Would individuals change what they were doing because of Kabbalistic motives? Yes, here and there. But these are rare individuals. If you're a Kabbalistic scholar and here or there you take on a Kabbalistic or pietic practice, okay, that's what individuals do. A regular person doesn't change halacha. You follow halacha. That's what you should keep. The mission of us already says is loy am haaretz chassid. Right at the beginning, when I was speaking about Chassidus, I said the term Chassidus dates back to Chazal. Chassid means something specific. Chassid means someone who is engaged in extra chumras, extra stringencies, extra spiritual practices. If you're an Amoritz, don't do that. If you're an Amoritz, keep halacha. That's your job. If you're a remarkable individual who is keeping a Shulchan Aruch perfectly, then you can engage in Chassidus and begin taking on extra things. The Chassidish movement, the Baal Shem Tov Chassidish movement, promotes Chassidus in the sense of extra practices, Kabbalistic practices, on a more mass level. Now, even if only done as an additional layer, in other words, we're going beyond halacha, even that would be controversial. Because who says it's healthy for people to do anything beyond halacha? Keep halacha, it's enough to keep halacha. Why are you engaging in mystical practices, particularly when they can lend themselves to misunderstandings, even if it's just an additional layer? But what happens if you're using Kabbalistic ideas to even change core halacha itself? Well, that becomes very problematic. Are there examples of Kabbalistic ideas changing core halacha itself? Well, absolutely. For example, the wearing of tefillin. So tefillin, tradition, it is a machlokes rishonim, there's different opinions. But the normative psak was to wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. Comes along Chassidim and say, don't wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed because Chol HaMoed these are registered Kabbalistic views, but should the masses begin changing their practice? The most controversial of Chassidic innovations, changing the text of tefillah. Chassidim came up with a new nusach tefillah. Why did they come up with a new nusach tefillah? The answer is because Ashkenazim always davened with Ashkenazi tradition of tefillah. Sfardim davens with Sfardi tradition of tefillah. The great Arizal, who biologically, genetically was Ashkenazi, but was raised in the Sephardi world, took the Sephardi nusach tefillah and taught within it various Kabbalistic meditations and the like. If you are an Ashkenazi and you want to start engaging in Lurianic practices, it simply doesn't work within Nusach Ashkenaz. So where do you go with that? So there's a number of approaches. Approach number 1 is to say, and this the Chasam Sofer many generations later spells out, it's true that the great Arizal showed Kabbalistic depth in the Sephardic ritual, but we can be assured that the Ashkenazi ritual also has great Kabbalistic depth. We need not worry about that. It's just Arizal, who was Sephardi, taught it in the Sephardi system. So that's what we have. But there's no reason to change Nusach HaTfilah in order to access the Kabbalistic secrets of Arizal. But nonetheless, what do you do if you are a Kabbalist and you want to engage in Kabbalistic meditation while you're davening. We don't have the Arizal teaching us how to do that in line with Ashkenazi ritual. So you change the nusach, you tweak it, and wherever there is a meditative or Kabbalistic or gematria or name of Hashem or the like to do in Ashkenazi nusach, and it doesn't fit, sorry, in Sephardi nusach, and in Ashkenazi nusach you can't do that, switch there to Sephardi nusach. So you end up with a hybrid nusach. You end up with a nusach which is founded on Ashkenazi nusach, but has layers of adaptation here and there where it looks more like Sephardi nusach in order to align with the Kabbalistic teachings of the Arizal. You end up with what we call Nusach Sfard. It's not Nusach Sfard, it's not the Sephardi Nusach. It's not the real Sephardi Nusach, but it was labeled Nusach Sfard because it's Ashkenazi with layers of what looks like Sephardi text on it. Was that ever done pre-Chassidus? The answer is yes, we know as a matter of historical fact. There is the odd Kabbalist here or there who wants to daven with Kabbalistic meditation, Kavanas, and can't do that with Nusach Ashkenaz, and therefore they created their own hybrid version. What about the masses? Why should us as mass Ashkenazim be deprived of these Kabbalistic secrets? No one says that we have Kabbalistic secrets in Nusach Ashkenaz also. We just didn't have the Arizal teaching us. Thus says the Chassim Sofer. The Chassim Sofer's own Rebbe, Reb Nosson Adler, predating Chassidus in Frankfurt, sets up a very small minyan so that he can daven a type of what we would nowadays call a Nusach Sfard. So he can daven with Kabbalistic meditation and the like. It arouses controversy in Frankfurt. This is pre the birth of Chassidus. It arouses controversy in Frankfurt because he's created his own minyan. But Reb Nosson Adler is one of Kabbalists doing it. But the idea that whole shuls change their Nusach isn't just Kabbalah adding a layer of stringency and piety to halacha. It's Kabbalah changing regular practice. And more than that, it's socially divisive because you have people leaving their regular shul and changing their nusach and creating a parallel shul, a shtibel. And now every town has its mainstream shul with nusach Ashkenaz and its little shul, its shtibel, its so-called little room, where those who have moved towards Chassidus begin davening in their new nusach. So level number one, to summarize what I'm trying to do here, I'm trying to look at what evidence do we have of Chassidus actually changing halacha, and at the end will be, are there any examples literally of Averi Lishma? Level number one, Chassidim are halachic mainstream. There's no doubt about that. The founding fathers of Chassidus, the first generation, second generation, third generation, are classic halachis. We have their shilas and shuvas, we have their halachic works. These are rabbonim and poskim and dayanim and so on. No question about that. Are there nonetheless some elements of halacha being rewritten? The answer is yes. With the spread of mass Kabbalistic practice, even if it's just chumrah and stringency and taking on extras, there's opposition, because who says the regular person should be doing Kabbalistic practices? Number one. And number two, here and there, the Kabbalistic practices begin even tweaking mainstream halacha. You have people taking a nusach tefillah and changing the nusach tefillah. How on earth can you do that? It's sociologically undermining because it's creating changes in shuls, and it's undermining the precious nusach tefillah. It's only centuries later that Reform begins rewriting tefillah. Who's ever heard of rewriting tefillah based upon your own spiritual insights? And then that's what's going on in the Chassidish world. So this is one example of where Kabbalistic practices begin intruding on communal life. Yeah. There are always changes in tefillah that take place. There's tefillahs that were added in. There were tweaks here and there, but the idea of a mass movement or setting out to recraft the Siddur in that way, that's something that hasn't really taken place overtly and openly since the era of the Gaonim. We spoke in our previous series about the Gaonim, who sent out the Siddur. People are writing tefillahs here and there. Personal mishaberachs, texts that are written. People will investigate manuscripts and say this text needs to be changed here and there. The idea of a large-scale mass rewriting of the Nusach Tefillah, very, very controversial. Yeah.
But it's Chassidim saying this is what I read with what.
Correct. Nusach Ari, which is another way of referring to Nusach Sfard, the Chassidish Nusach, is the Ziknei Chassidim, the third generation Chassidish teachers, look at Nusach Ashkenaz and say, how can we tweak the text so that it aligns with the Kabbalistic insights of the Arizal? There are a number of Nusach Aris. Chabad has its own Chassidish Nusach. Sajigor has its own Chassidish Nusach. Belz has its own Chassidish Nusach. The published sort of Eshkol Nusach Sfard, Chassidish Nusach, is a hybrid of a lot of the different Nusach Aris that were floating around. And really each Chassidish court had its own Nusach Ari based upon the Ziknei Chassidim, the founding fathers of Chassidus, who tweaked the Nusach to align it with the Arizal's thought. Yeah.
coming at that time, was that people saying
Oh,
before?
so there are a number of, and this actually ties into your question also. There are a number of Kabbalistic texts that became inserted into the mainstream Nusach HaTfilah. Many of them are identifiable by being in Aramaic, like Baruch Shemai. These are texts that are Kabbalistic texts, but work their way into the Nusach Tfilah through various Kabbalistic channels, including but not limited to Chassidus. So, for example, in Germany, the influence of the Shloh HaKadosh, the great Shloh, brought various Kabbalistic texts into the Nusach HaTfilah, predating Chassidus. So Chassidus isn't the only channel in which Kabbalistic practices enter the mainstream world. The great Magen Avraham, the primary, one of the primary Nosei Kelim commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, here and there will bring a halachic discussion, and then they'll say, "Ubksovim in the writings it says to do X, Y, Z." What are these ksovim? These writings? They're Kisvei Ari. They're still manuscript writings Ari that are floating around Europe. So I don't be purist about this. Kabbalah and halacha are always in conversation. The great Vilna Gaon is a Kabbalist. He's not opposing the concept of Kabbalah, but the idea of a mass change of nusach based upon Kabbalah is disturbing and revolutionary. I tried when I said this tension between the spirit and the letter of the law, the Christian terminology, but this tension's always there in Yiddishkeit, and there's always. I gave I think a Gadol Shabbos Shuvah Drasha many years ago about the role of the interaction between Kabbalah and Halacha. These are not new conversations, but Chassidim are seen as taking this much further. Then there's another problem with taking on Kabbalah on a mass level, which is humans have finite energy. You can't do everything all the time. So what's the better way of enhancing your spirituality? Is it by taking on stringency in halacha? Stringency means being more careful in your halachic practice. Or is it by taking on mystical practices? Now, the traditional answer, at least on a mass level, was stringency in halacha. The Chassidim actually mount a campaign against stringency in halacha, because they say better to take on mystical enhancements of your mitzvahs rather than extra stringency in halacha. So you have to keep halacha, of course, with halachas, but then take on another chumrah and another layer of protection and the like, other than here or there. Rather take on a mystical. If you think about energy as being finite, so we have to keep halacha. That consumes a decent percentage of our we have a lot to balance. We have to balance communal responsibilities and earning a livelihood and social and family obligations and the like, and then throw into the mix and halacha. How much spare energy do we have for extra spiritual progression? So what do you do in your spare time, as it were? What do you do if you want to advance spiritually? This is a real life question for us in this room, right? Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur pass. So I want to upgrade my spiritual life. Okay, what do I do? Do I start volunteering to do more chesed? Do I go to an extra shir and learn Gemara in more depth? Do I start taking on an extra chumrah in halachic practice? Do I take mystical practices on? Do I engage in more mystical meditation? And humans have finite ability, so what do you prioritize? So again, this is again a fact found in the tshuvas of the early Chassidim masters. There is a general pushback against chumrah. They say rather than taking on the stringency on halacha, better to engage in mystical practices. Some of the halachic decisions of Chassidus, and it's very hard to know why this became a factor, have other sociological implications. I can't get my head completely around this and understand why this arose from the Chassidish world, but Chassidim introduced a chumrah in Hilchas Shechita. It's a technical chumrah about how the knife is sharpened and the like. Why this emerged from Chassidus, I don't know, and how does this tie into other mystical things, or was it coincidence? It happened to be that the early Chassidish masters, who were also poskim, happened to hold this chumrah, and therefore it became associated with Chassidus. However, it is a fact that what part of the controversy, one of the Chassidish innovations, was a stringency in Shechita. Now you might say that's fairly harmless. Okay, so there's a stringency being taken on, okay. However, there are two problems with this. One is, should we be, again, taking on mass stringencies? There's a general trend in halacha of caution against mass stringencies against precedent. It's seen somehow as being insulting to previous generations. And the second thing is, when it comes to shechita, again, it is uniquely sociologically divisive. Because if your Chassidish sheikhtim are doing shechita different to the mainstream sheikhtim, you suddenly end up with rival hechsherim. We know the problems that rival hechsherim creates. More than that, you're taking livelihoods away from people. A new Chassidish group opens in town. Suddenly, the old shochet isn't kosher for it because he's doing shechita the old-fashioned way. So we have to set up our own shechita. So what about the old shochet now? What happens to his livelihood? He loses 50% of his customers. More than that, Shechita used to be controlled by the Kehillah. It was the provenance of the Rav. So you have someone undermining the authority of the Rav, because the Rav is overseeing the Shechit, and suddenly a new community opens, and they say, oh, the Rav's Shechita is not good enough. More than that, it used to be a source of income for the town, because a tax was put on all Jewish meat that was sold, and this is how the town maintained its institutional structures. So if you set up a rival shochet, you're setting up funding to set up rival institutions. And suddenly every town has 2 shuls and 2 mikvahs and 2 communities and 2 gemachim and 2 everything, and there's a sociological and communal and financial element to this. So out of this blend of Kabbalistic practices being introduced, a general push against Chumrah, a change of Nusach Tefillah, the occasional Chumrah which became associated with Chassidim, like Shrita, and I'll mention another one in a minute. You have the emergence of parallel communities in each town, and again you can see how beyond the abstract halachic issues lying behind this becomes explosive communally. There was another Chassidish Chumrah that developed, which is avoidance of wearing any wool garments. Don't wear wool at all. Why? Because if you wear wool, there's a problem of having linen in and you end up with sharpness. So avoid wearing wool and you will avoid any problems at all. Can you see controversy that can emerge from this? Well, can I daven in a shul where the chazan, the Baal Tefillah, is wearing wool? Can he daven for the tefillah or not? Do I want to daven in such thing? These are live teshuvos. We have records of this, of a number of halachas that seem to have wreaked havoc with the social structure of communities in East Europe. And now you can take on as a personal chumrah not to wear wool. Maybe it's even a good chumrah to take on. But do I have a right to object when the Baal Tefillah, who wants to daven for the Amud, who's maybe got a yahrzeit today or in Avedus, or is just an employed chazan of the shul, wants to wear wool? So there are changes in halacha and in nusach that are affecting society in a very real and visceral way. Okay, so to summarize what I've said so far, because now we go on to the more controversial stuff. Summarize what I've said so far. Number one, Chassidim are the bedrock of Chassidus is very clearly mainstream halacha, mainstream poskim. There's no doubt about that at all. Number one. Number two, Chassidim do introduce various Kabbalistic stringencies. Okay? Controversial. Should we be taking on Kabbalistic practices? But at least it's adding, not taking away. But all addition starts taking away because humans have finite energy, and there is a Chassidish push against halachic stringencies. More than that, some of the Kabbalistic practices taken on begin altering regular ritual, Nusach Tefillah being the most prominent of them. And more than that, for reasons that are difficult to understand, there are a variety of unique halachic stances that Chassidim take, many of which are very fundamental to the fabric of life, seemingly trivial things, but impact the functioning of communities, like which sort of knife you use for shechita, and like whether the Baal Tefillah can wear wool garments or not. Okay. Is there anything more we can say? And the answer is yes. There are examples in Chassidish literature of Kabbalah being used to directly influence halachic decision-making and mysticism in a very overt way. One of the claims of Chassidus, and something we haven't really addressed yet, and we will get to, is that low-level prophecy and divine intuition is around. And part of the Chassidish doctrine is that tzaddikim have forms of near-prophetic or prophetic experiences which give them unique insight. And we see this again to this day in the Chassidish world, in which people will go to the tzaddik and get advice about all sorts of things about which the tzaddik has no rational ability to know about or comment on in medical treatment, livelihood decisions, and the like, using Ruach HaKodesh, divine inspiration. Is this nevuah or quasi-nevuah? It's some element of that. Again, the Rambam lists 10 levels of prophecy. Ruach HaKodesh is one of the lower levels. Are these terms meant literally or not? But certainly there is a belief in a degree of divine intuition. By the way, there are Chassidish sources that say since everyone is meant to become a mystic, everyone can have such form of Ruach HaKodesh. It's something that even regular people can have. But let's... This theology is explicit in the Maggid of Mezeritch and cited by the next generation of students. The Noam Elimelech, the great Rebbe Elimelech of Lezhensk, explicitly quotes in the name of a tradition, in the name of the Maggid of Mezeritch, that we have Nevuah back in Klal Yisrael. The prophetic age came to an end. The answer is it came to an end in the first, with the close of the first Beis HaMikdash era, but we are in unique historical circumstances where prophecy or near prophecy or quasi-prophecy is around again. Why? How do you theologically explain that? So he uses an analogy. He says, when the king is in the palace, access to the king is very difficult and very privileged and surrounded by ritual. You can't just turn up and visit the king in the palace. There's a process you have to go through. Only elite and select individuals are able to get there. They have to have years of training. They have to follow palace protocol and the like. Very, very difficult to speak to the king. When I'll use the Queen as an example because we have stories on this. When the Queen is in Balmoral and walking around in the countryside, passing ramblers can have conversations with her. We know these. Everyone knows the story of the. Okay, there are lots and lots of stories of the Queen hiking in around Balmoral. When the king is in exile, they are more easily accessible. So says the Maggid on Mezeritch, when we are in Golus, the ShemTov Galusa, again, one of these mystical ideas, God is somehow in exile. His normally taken to mean his presence is concealed. There's hest upon him. Says the Maggid Mezeritch in a twist, no, if the king is in exile, he's more accessible to people because the palace protocol has broken down. The ritual has and therefore it's easier for us in these later generations to access spirituality in a paradoxical way. Shechina B'Galusa gives us a unique advantage, which is that, yes, it's tragic that we are in Golus, but as a result, it's easier in certain respects to access spirituality and achieve spiritual insight. So there are claims of Ruach HaKodesh and divine intuition. We have records dating back to the first generation of Chassidus, in which Pasak Halacha, the claim goes, is based upon Ruach HaKodesh. Is an animal treif or not? Can this food be eaten or not? Well, with prophetic insight, I can see spiritually whether this is treif or not, and therefore I can paskin on that, because I can see is there a tumor spirit hanging over this animal or not. By the way, in the Kabbalistic circles outside Chassidus, there were also claims of such spiritual possibility, but they're not using it to paskin halacha. There's a tradition in Brisk, in the name of the Beis Halevi. I mentioned before there were Kabbalistic circles outside Chassidus. I mentioned, for example, they used to use the word klois. Klois meant somewhat analogous to the modern term kollel. Meant a very elite Yiddish word linked to the word cloister, very unique study circle of Kabbalist clois in Brody I mentioned, where the Baal Shem Tov's brother-in-law came from. The Beis Halevi, according to tradition, is reported as saying, when we were children in the clois, we could see whether a mezuzah was kosher or posel just by looking at it from the outside. Because if a mezuzah is an artifact of kedusha, then surely a spiritually sensitive person can look at it and see whether it's kosher or not. You can see whether it's kedusha or not. Can we use that for Pesach? You know, instead of going to the sofa, who has to rigorously check every letter of the mezuzah and look in detail whether the letter is cracked or not with their microscope, maybe we can just use divine intuition and see whether it has kedusha or not. So there are reports of early Chassidus doing these things, and this arouses controversy for obvious reasons. There are stories about the Baal Shem Tov in which it's claimed that the Baal Shem Tov himself ate an animal in which there was a shaila of treifus using Ruach HaKodesh. Now, did that story take place or not? I have no idea. But is that story cited in a third and fourth generation source, the Shifrei HaBaal Shem Tov? Yes, it is. It's cited there in print, black and white. So I mentioned already there's a hagiographical work called Shifrei HaBaal Shem Tov in praise of the Baal Shem Tov, written by the son-in-law of someone who was very close to the students of the Baal Shem Tov. So it has a degree of authority in which these claims are made. Now, whether this story took place as a matter of history or not is controversial. But the claim being made that the Baal Shem Tov himself was using Ruach HaKodesh to paskin halacha, you can see why this is a very dangerous claim. Okay, unfortunately, we have run out of time, so we'll have to stop here. We'll continue next week. Just to summarize where we are up to, the first part of the shir was dealing with relatively uncontroversial ideas. It is a matter of historical record that Chassidim were great halachists, no doubt, that they began using Kabbalah to make changes here and there in the halachic practice, and this aroused controversy. We're now looking at a much more dangerous idea. Maybe they are altering the very nature of Pesach and using Ruach HaKodesh to paskin, and there is evidence either of that taking place or that subsequent early generations of Chassidim believed it was taking place. And this, of course, is very controversial. We'll stop here for today, and please God carry on next week. I wish everyone a good week, and quick plug for the events taking place this week. Please do make an effort to come tomorrow evening for Yom HaZikaron and on Wednesday evening for Yom HaTzmaut.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, 24 hour candles,
Thank you.
I don't know. You know.